Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to be in your company today, and it is an honor to be addressing a topic that we have been hearing about throughout this morning, of course, being the entrepreneurial opportunity and the importance of entrepreneurs right now in the economic might of BRICS and ensuring its sustainability as well as its development. So we're going to be hearing from entrepreneurs themselves right now about how the operating environment has been for them, particularly in the past 15 years. We'll also be hearing from financiers about what the financing opportunity has been in BRICS and what the future financing opportunity potentially could be. Of course, reflecting on what is working right now and what should be improved to increase market access. So allow me to introduce you to the panel, starting with Mr. Basim Haidar. He is the chairman and CEO of BH Holdings Group, a celebrated entrepreneur and philanthropist. Could you kindly welcome him with a warm applause? As well as Mr. Diego Perez from the Brazilian Association of Fintechs. Mr. Igor Zelezetsky, the CEO of the Financial Advisory Center of Gazprom Bank. Mr. Biju Patel, who is the Group CEO of the ETG Group, India, Brazil. And last but not least, Ms. Haijing Zhao, the Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer over at the Chinese Investment Corporation. Good afternoon to you all. I'm looking forward to this conversation. And Basim, I want to start off with you. So right now you are building the second cannabis manufacturing plant here in South Africa, in Pretoria. You essentially have got business exposure to every corner of the BRICS grouping right now and more. The celebrated success, but perhaps the backstory. How has your journey in gaining market access within the BRICS grouping been? What has worked?
Thanks, Fifi. Basically, as you know, I'm African. I was born in Nigeria, so it was pretty much my home when I started. So I started my businesses first in West Africa, learn the terrain, understand the cultures, the different cultures, and the diversity in Africa. But it was a very natural thing to start to expand to the south and North Africa, East Africa, and so on. And dealing with a lot of regulations is still a huge blocker for business, and especially for those that do not understand the African terrain. One of the issues is so many different laws and regulations in each of these countries. On top of that, many of the regulators that have been in power have been there so long, and they need to adapt to the new way and the new youth of how we do business today across Africa and across the BRICS countries. I have seen in some places where there's been a lot of technological advances, mainly because the regulators understood what SMEs needed and how they could become large businesses. Obviously, I'm in technology, I'm in investments, I'm in agriculture on the medical cannabis side, as you rightly said. I chose, obviously, South Africa because the regulations were easy in terms of South Africa being kind of one of the rare signatories to a UN convention on medical cannabis, and the regulator having very strong standards that were accepted globally, which is unfortunately not available in many other African countries. Besides that, obviously, the availability of land and the infrastructure to be able to export high quality grade medical cannabis out of the continent.
Sure.
You take that into context and you try and apply the same thing in other BRICS nations where we operate. It's impossible. It's just a completely different formula. So the idea was to always try and operate with the local partners that understand the markets a lot better than we do, but I think what is missing here is proper trade agreements between the BRICS countries and the newcomers, hopefully, as the BRIC expands. Today, you've got ECOWAS, you've got COMESA, you've got, I think someone needs to look at all of this again in the frame of the BRICS itself and maybe reevaluate and refurbish these agreements to better fit today's world.
So I'm going to come back to you for the specifics, particularly around the regulation that has made it difficult for you to expand, and also the trade agreements that you think could make your life and perhaps some of your respective colleagues in the SME and SMME sector rather on the continent as well as in the BRICS grouping a lot easier. But before I do, Bijou, I'm actually going to hopscotch all the way to you, sir, because your business also quite deep-rooted in Africa, although you currently connect quite a number of small farmers with their exports in the agricultural sector to many places in the world right now. Basim was talking about the fact that he's managed to grow, notwithstanding some of the headwinds around regulation. What has your expansion story been like, and what would you change?
You know, it's entrepreneurship, and the journey has been an extremely rewarding as well as a challenging experience, right, over a longer period of time. On any given day, you have both extremes, right, extreme challenge, extreme reward. And so you just have to sort of knuckle down and keep pushing forward and finding ways of getting through whatever obstacles they may be, whatever challenges they may be, and keep thriving towards a common focus or a common goal, right? But, you know, one of the biggest challenges we can perhaps talk about across, you know, and we largely see this across most of the markets we operate within, is the regulatory environment. Again, coming back to what my colleague just said earlier. And the regulatory environment needs to sort of enable entrepreneurship. It needs to enable SMEs, MMEs investments, and so on and so forth, right? So whether we talk about India, whether we talk about Africa, a very fair, just, stable regulatory environment needs to be created. I think, and this is something as a BRICS community, we really need to sit down and figure it out, right? We're all sitting here on a wonderful stage, but I think, and just, again, we can't expect our lawmakers or our decision makers to sort of drive that. I think it's for business, and that's how, again, the whole concept of entrepreneurship starts, right? It's for business to sort of drive these changes, explore these initiatives, and force leadership and government to sort of create these frameworks. So I think that responsibility starts with us, largely. And I think we have to sort of drive a more common framework within the BRICS community. There's a lot of dynamic plays happening, whether you talk about, and from a geopolitical sense, largely, right? But it's important, I think, for us to sort of sit down and figure out what sort of works, find that commonality, and build on that.
Okay, well, that's the purpose of this platform. We're here as business to talk about that, and hopefully we'll be able to walk away with the solutions when this all wraps up. Diego, representing the fintechs over in Brazil, the largest economy over in Latin America right now. I imagine that a lot of the companies that you do represent as an association are looking beyond Brazil's borders. How has that journey been for them, particularly within the BRICS cluster?
Okay. Well, first of all, it's a privilege to be here alongside the brightest mind of our group, the BRICS nations. And in Brazil, the fintech scenario is thriving. We are growing very fast, and we have
Diego, can you speak a little bit louder? I want to make sure that I catch every single word you say.
So in Brazil, we have a successful use cases from fintechs.
Sure.
You know, so there are companies that can comprise all the Brazilian territory, but also offer services not only in Latin America, but also elsewhere, like Asia, Africa, and so on. And now we are now receiving the fintechs from our nations as well to set foot in Brazil, like the major one, the platforms that can provide cross-border payments and services for travelers and so on. And all of this was possible because of a public agenda to foster innovation, to foster technology on the benefit of the financial services in Brazil. The financial services in Brazil is very efficient. This is not a problem. The main problem is because it's very concentrated. We have only 5 big banks holding at least 80% of the financial services in Brazil. So we have to dilute this concentration by opening doors for innovation, for the smallers, for the challengers, for fintech companies that can offer those services for the people or for the small business as well, that sometimes they don't have the proper access for their services, or when they have it, they struggle with the high costs, okay?
Sure.
So We work together with the regulator, and we try to organize the market to show them the benefits, how to provide a better business environment by considering the innovation and the technology as a key solution to include the Brazilian population and the Brazilian small business on the financial market.
Sure. So your challenge has been slightly different in a sense. Market dominance by established players has perhaps been the biggest difficulty in growth and expansion of SMEs.
Yeah, the market domination is not only the main problem, but they do not have the basic services, financial services for the daily operations, you know. And when they have, it's just a small amount, and they don't have a lot of opportunities as a big company that have access to capital markets, to insurances, and to foreign exchange services, and so on. So it's important to open the opportunities for small business by making these services available for them. And the fintechs are playing a key role for that, because with the same dynamic of a big company in Brazil, they can offer financial services for a small group or for a specific region. So we can work with this, because Brazil is a very big country. We have more than 200 million people. Yeah. We have a gigantic territory, so you can focus on certain regions, certain groups of population to make this possible.
All right, okay. Hajing, I want to come to you as the starter of the perspective of financiers right now in operating in the BRICS cluster, and perhaps hearing from some of these SMEs who are looking for access to capital to either start or even scale. But first of all, I would also like to hear your view on the role of SMEs in China right now in driving the growth of the economy in the past as well as the future.
Thank you, Fifi. And I've been in South Africa for a few days because I'm the chairperson for the Women's Business Alliances BRICS. So I have been extremely impressed by the live and vibrant energy of South Africa, and also has been very moved by the hospitality and the warmth of the South African people. And this is a beautiful country, so it's my great honor to be here, and also great honor to be at this session. Actually, the small and medium enterprises for the Chinese economy, they are very important. And also, Chinese people, just like the people from other BRICS countries, are very entrepreneurial.
Sure.
So ever since the reform and the opening up of China, the entrepreneur spirit has really flourished. And the SME has been really growing to become extremely important. And also, I want to make one point, that usually people say that we need technology to enable SMEs. But actually, there's the other side to it also. That is, SMEs themselves, actually, they're the probably very important innovators. Because usually for the larger corporations, we say that they have a lot more R&D resources, right? Mm-hmm. Research and development. So they have a lot of innovation. But for the disruptive, revolutionary kind of technology, actually the SMEs sometimes play a more important role. And for example, in China, for 1 or 2 decades, we have like now the electric vehicle company, BYD, which is now very well known worldly.
Yeah. They recently launched in South Africa.
And also we have companies like Tencent, right? Of course, they used to be SMEs, okay, extremely small. Of course, we have Alibaba, Jingdong, etc. for e-commerce. So all of these companies, they used to be SMEs, but then with technology, they've been really growing and become top companies in the world. So this is one point I'd like to make for SME. They are really important for innovation. And of course, earlier, my colleague, Mr. Zhang Shaogang, mentioned in China, there is this number, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which is easy for people to remember.
Sure.
That is something like, in terms of numbers, 90% of the companies are SMEs, of course. But in terms of innovation, actually 70% come from those companies. And I have to look at the number and say, for what is the 8 actually 80% of urban employment come from those companies. Okay. Anyway, Mr. Zhang Shaogang mentioned earlier, so I'm not going to continue to talk about the numbers, but I want to say one more thing about the SME, which is inclusive financing. And it's interesting that, first of all, SME face financial bottlenecks. They do need financial support. But on the other hand, we are seeing in China that the technology have been making inclusive financing more economical and more feasible. Because with big data and the AI, etc., you are able to track the records of the companies a lot better. And also with big data, you can analyze their credit worthiness a lot easier. And also with digital technology, you can reduce the cost of transacting. So all of this, I think, has been very helpful for SME development, and I do think that SME has a great future in the whole BRICS countries.
Just a quick one. So what is the framework of inclusive financing in China? How does that work?
Sorry?
Inclusive financing. You were talking about China embracing inclusive financing, particularly for SMEs. What does that look like?
Okay. I think that, first of all, the Chinese government has issued quite a few guidelines saying that our banks, our investors, etc., should try to support the real economy and SMEs. As I said earlier, actually technology is also making this economical. Because in the past, many people say that SMEs higher risk, maybe less return, and etc. Right? But now with the technology, you can improve and make it more feasible. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification. Igor, in Russia right now, I think many people are aware of the operating environment within your country right now. But just talking about the role of SMEs as Russia sees it right now, how much importance would you put on small businesses, medium-sized businesses in Russia's economy?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for inviting me on this panel, and thank you for the people of Johannesburg and to the organizers for such a welcoming atmosphere. It's been fantastic so far. I think SMEs in the current environment with the several years of volatility that we've seen globally showed that they are extremely adaptable, and they actually demonstrated the strengths of the not only of the medium and larger SMEs, but of the small guys as well. The survivability levels were quite high, and has to be said, it's visible across the various industrial sectors. So it's been, the years of volatility have been very fruitful for the future statistical analysis of why they're so resilient and robust, and in many instances they're more resilient than larger counterparts within the same industries. So it's been quite unique actually to follow it. But since we are discussing the SMEs in an international context, because BRICS, it's probably less about individual countries. It's more about what we can do, which synergies we can find. If we look at the goals that we as finances pursue, or what we can do to support SMEs, the basic goals are quite simple. We strive to provide the lowest possible interest rate to the SMEs to finance them sufficiently. We, again, in the BRICS format, if possible, we can improve connectivity of SMEs, improve the supply chains between the countries. And another important aspect is to find solutions to support SMEs in sectors that are considered to be high risk in terms of high credit risk, such as high-tech, biotech sectors. So we know that survival rates in these sectors are comparatively low. If we look across the spectrum of SMEs, nevertheless, we know that these guys must be supported because, as the colleagues just said, they're to a large extent they're the drivers of the innovation. So the analysis of various dynamics within the SMEs across BRICS is very important. And I think there is a lot of potential in that space.
Sure. I imagine that trying to provide capital right now, you mentioned at the lowest possible interest rates. Of course, we do know that interest rates are at some of the highest levels that we have seen in our recent history for all of us. And so if we just stick on the issue of interest rates and the cost of capital right now, most SMEs will always talk about the fact that the cost of capital and access of capital for the sector is quite difficult. And Bijou, I wanted you to perhaps reflect on this, because it was notable that your organization received a significant amount of money from the CDC, which is the UK's development finance institution. And my question to you is, why the UK's development financial institution? Where was Africa and where was BRICS?
Yeah, so perhaps just to take a step back, right? So it's also the cost of financing today. That's a big concern for SMEs, MMEs, right? Where global interest rates are, it's for many startups, it's probably very difficult to take debt onto their balance sheets. And so, I mean, over a period of time, and obviously it's a long-term journey, you build the right relationships, you build the right networks, because what you're doing on the ground, what businesses you're building on the ground, creates an impact to different institutions, right? So we're not just banked by the global DFIs or the UK-based DFIs. We're also banked by a lot of African DFIs. We're banked by a lot of Indian DFIs.
Sure.
And the benefit from, you know, the more localized DFIs, and when I talk about that, for example, India Exim or Afri Exim, is that they are able to weather and support you with some of the cost benefits when you have a higher interest rate regime. They're able to provide some form of subsidy support and structuring that assists, and not just for entities like ours, but SMEs, MMEs around the world, because that's their mandate, right? Their mandate is to go and support development, their mandate is to create impact, etc. And I think the thought that we must all take back is, what can we as a BRICS organization do to create the same or a similar type of an institution to support these entities that are really trying to develop and grow from. And as my colleague said, right, there was a time when Alibaba was just a startup, and the same for any African organization, right, or Indian organization. In India, we've had Ola, big conglomerates were startups at some stage. But they had access to the right support in the form of the right financing, and I think that's what we as a BRICS community need to figure out. Is there something we can do from a venture cap perspective with the BRICS Bank that can support these institutions, that can provide finance that, sort of at least keeps these organizations going through these turbulent headwinds until the global markets reflect a better regime? I think that's what we should.
For sure. Alibaba, and of course, Hajing did also make reference of Tencent, which is quite a familiar story in the South African context. Many of South Africans and its other investors that do span across the world know the story quite well. Basim, access to money to have grown. I mean, you're operating in like 30 countries right now. The customer base, particularly in your financial services businesses, ranging over sort of 560 million customers. Was access to money difficult for you? And I suppose maybe the more important question is, how should access to capital be improved?
I mean, there's a couple of things that we really need to look at here, because when we talk about interest rates, we somehow psychologically link that to the dollar or the pound interest rates. But when you operate across the emerging markets and the BRICS countries, you realize interest rates in some of these countries are in excess of 25%. You want to conduct business in the country and you're trying to borrow financing to grow. Banks are looking at it very differently today, and banks are saying, well, okay, I'm going to lend you in dollars, but you're earning in Naira in Nigeria, for example. The rate in Nigeria started this year at 450, it's 940 today.
Sure.
So imagine borrowing. It's not only about the interest rate costs you got to worry about. You got to worry about, how am I going to pay back those dollars or those pounds or those euros when the currency has halved in value? This is the biggest risk that we're facing. So in the absence of a single currency that we can trade with, access to capital is going to become worse and worse as we go on with time, because interest is just a cost, it's a line in the business. Inflation and depreciation of multiple currencies is an issue, to the extent, for example, we operate in 42 countries. We deal with about 35 different currencies. Can you imagine the reconciliation in terms of if we had debt? Luckily, we don't have the debt, but imagine we had the debt and we're suffering in this country, or the shilling has collapsed, or the CFR now is being unpegged from the euro. What's going to happen to that, etc.? So we have to worry all the time about how do we continue operations when all of a sudden we see income that is coming in diminishing as a result of depreciation in these currencies.
So you support a BRICS currency?
There has to be. It's not a matter of support. There has to be. If the BRICS nations are going to have to grow, they're going to have their own single currency. The banking system eliminates the risk they then tie to the different basket of currencies that we see today. And unfortunately, until this happens, access to capital not only is very difficult, but it's becoming very expensive. So even when it's available, you have to worry about taking that capital.
Sure.
And this is the problem. The second thing is, I think, if I may, Fifi, is that, you know, I was researching a lot about the BRICS Business Council and so on. And actually, when you go deeper into it, you look at the BRICS Business Council is kind of there, but it's to promote that specific country's interest within a specific sector. So if you look at South Africa, it's mainly focused on tourism, which is inbound travel in a way, and hotels and hospitality. But what does that say for international trade with the other BRICS countries? What does the BRICS Business Council actually do? Have we looked at trade agreements, for example, between the BRICS nations? Are we still working on the WTO standards, or do we need a new set of agreements that define the businesses, transfer of technology, intellectual property, transfer pricing between these countries? This is the big challenges we're still facing today.
You asked a question, so I'm going to ask you to answer it. Do we need new agreements?
100%.
Okay, perfect.
The agreements we have are outdated anyway.
Sure.
I mean, they're not defining today's world. It's a very new era today.
Okay. Diego, the BRICS currency, the idea around that, you've given the opportunity of Brazil. You look, because of the colonial past with Africa and Latin America, you have a lot of Portuguese-speaking people over in Mozambique, over in Angola. Would a BRICS currency, in your view, make it easier for SMEs to penetrate deeper into the BRICS cluster and ultimately improve market access?
Okay. Well, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
So it's quite important to standardize this movement. So if the Brazilian small companies have the willingness to penetrate markets like Africa or China, they have to be able to move the money from Brazil to there, or to receive the money from those regions back to Brazil. Otherwise, you left a lot of money on the table, as we used to say in Brazil, with cost fees and transactions. So in this case, but we have to be careful about the proper standard, the proper technology. How do we do that? Because each region has its own reality and its own way to manage money, to handle money, and to transact. In Brazil now, we have a fast payment system, which called BRICS, which was a great success because mainly 100% of the economically active population have used it once, you know.
Sure.
So it's impressive. And now we are moving forward for these kind of transactions to send and to receive money. But if the other BRICS nations doesn't have a similar system or doesn't have the culture of the population to use it, it's not going to work. So it's important to highlight how you can benefit the technology to transact money, to move money from the regions, and maybe a common currency would help, but I don't know the answer yet.
Okay. Bijou, I want to stick to the entrepreneurial view right now on a common currency, and whether like some of your respective peers in the entrepreneurial space, you see there's a case for it, or whether you are happy to reconcile the different currencies in which you do get payments and make transactions with at the end of each month.
You know, I think we can perhaps take an example of past successes, right? And forget the European common currency, but just in West Africa, you have the CFA currency regime, which is predominantly driven by the Francophone-speaking part of West Africa. And to invest and do business in those markets is just a pleasure. It's easier to externalize currency there, it's easier to make investments, it's easier to channel and get support from the central banks there. And I mean, it's still relatively young, I would say, but that experience has been extremely, extremely positive. So, you know, from our end, it would be 100% support towards a common currency.
Okay, so let's put the idea of the BRICS currency to bed right now and move on. Haijing, just I think it is important to reflect on the fact that the China Investment Corporation, the China Investment Company, is one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, and therefore how you view investments and the criteria of how you select where you put money in, where you don't, which SMEs you support, which SMEs you don't, is pretty important for the people in this room to hear. Can you give us that detail?
Yeah. Thank you, Fifi. I think that one lesson we all have learned is that freer flow of goods and the investment is crucial for economic prosperity across the globe. So before I answer your question, I'd like to say some of my personal stories, right? For example, I think with the new technology, actually space and the distance is a lesser problem for many companies, even for the smaller companies. And for example, in China, right, I can order from the internet a box of apple from a faraway province, for example, Guizhou, which is in the mountain, okay, very far away. I can order that, and then which helps the employment in that province, and also help reduce poverty, okay, because I order more products. The other example I want to give you is that a few years ago, I traveled to India, and I discovered a very good product, which is neem facial cleanser, okay?
Okay.
Which is cheap and high quality, actually, very good quality. Ever since I discovered that, the name is Himalaya, okay? Anyway, ever since I discovered that product, I have been ordering that product through internet.
Okay.
And also, of course, you know, if you read President Xi's recent article, he mentioned that from South Africa, the South Africans' wine, tea, aloe vera are what he called the trending products. Actually, in China, there is a nickname for these trending products. They're called internet celebrity products.
Oh, wow.
Okay? Yeah, so once you become the internet celebrity products, many people will buy it from you, all right? So I think those have been really good businesses. Now, of course, you know, the list can go on. You know, you can buy beef from Brazil and chocolate from Russia. You know, this is really amazing. I think this new technology in terms of promoting international trade, consumption, etc. Now, in order to make this possible, I think there are a few preconditions. For example, one is that we need the regulatory environment which promotes open access to market, okay? We also need infrastructure like the financial infrastructure which allows international payment, money to flow around, okay? We also need physical infrastructure and the logistics. For example, I order something, they have to be able to transport to me, right?
Sure.
So all of this, I think, are important preconditions for a good flow, quality flow of goods and investment. Now, for CSC, we are China's sovereign wealth fund, and indeed, we are over $1 trillion assets under management. We try to contribute to international prosperity by investing in several areas. So one area is actually infrastructure and logistics. The other area would be private equity, VC, venture capital, in order to help the, you know, whether it's small or bigger companies to grow. So that's the private equity. We also invest in areas like agriculture. For example, recently, I'm happy to find out that we recently invested a company in South Africa that we're going to visit them the day after tomorrow. And 20% of the revenue and profits from China, they sell to China, okay? So I think those are good examples where there's tremendous opportunity. And with those opportunities, I think China Investment Corporation, we can invest in those areas, And also, of course, I forgot to say, energy transformation.
Sure.
Power generation. I think those are the areas that we really want to put money in. So I do hope that we have a better governance and we have a better international governance also at the same time so that we can invest and make financial returns, at the same time helping the local economy and helping people getting more employment, high quality employment.
Sure, sure. No, thanks for those reflections. Igor, I suppose the same question can be extended to you as a Gazprom Bank in terms of how you approach investments. But also, I wanted to speak to you about an idea that you shared prior to this panel, and it was an idea that actually kind of dovetails from what the Minister of Small Businesses here in South Africa mentioned, the idea of this entrepreneurial ecosystem. But you were talking about a cross-border entrepreneurial cluster of firms that shared a common strategy to improve competitiveness of SMEs. Practically, what would that look like and how would it work?
Yes, thank you. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the finances available to support SMEs, among other sectors, in each jurisdiction, as well as, say, across the BRICS, the resources are finite. So we probably should not approach it from the point of view that there is endless amount of money that we can just allocate in order to support the green shoots of the SMEs. So from there, we have to understand again, in the BRICS context and in the context of cooperation and harmonization, we have to understand the broad universe of the SMEs that are out there. If anyone ever sort of got involved in the analytics which are relevant to the SMEs, portfolio analysis and so on, they know that the SMEs are the most difficult sector to analyze. Why? Because the SMEs differ by size. So what's considered to be SME in Europe is up to turnover 50 million euros. What's considered to be the smallest SME in Africa, it's or individual business, we're talking about $100 equivalent and so on. So it's a vast and diverse universe. There are diversification of sectors, diversification of financial products that are being provided, and the jurisdictional specifics, the regulatory framework that colleagues were discussing. So it's harmonizing that in the BRICS context will take a lot of understanding. So information has to be collected in some sort of database that will create a universe, a common language that all BRICS countries, all lenders, for example, and to the extent consumers, will understand. It would be much easier to lend cross-border if you know the credit quality profile of the SME that you are lending. And it doesn't mean that the money will flow only to the cherry-picked few. Of course, that tendency will emerge as well. But a sober approach by, say, a fund, which we actually talked about at our working group, a fund that would be designed to support SMEs, a more sober approach would be to create classification, say, of various SMEs. For example,
sure.
We have SMEs with a proven track record that are repaying regularly for last several years. These guys deserve, as local champions, they deserve a lower interest rate.
All right.
Right? So we already provided funding to a bucket of companies that will return. And then remaining of the funds we can direct to companies with a higher risk profile and so on, because we want to support them, knowing fully, going with open eyes into the sector, that they will that we need to support them. So in order to create this, if you'd like, infrastructure, the database, which is critical, which is actually exists in most banks, especially those who work with SMEs,
Sure.
we need cooperative efforts. And a lot can be done by the SME lobby groups in each of the jurisdiction to combine these forces and to improve transparency and inform the lenders as to what these guys are, and then we can devise a strategy who to support, which funds to direct where, and again, in terms of funding potential of BRICS, it's as big as anywhere. If we pull it together, it's incredible.
All right. Lots to say about this topic. Unfortunately, not a lot of time left. We have less than 2 minutes between us. So I'm going to be a bit biased, and I want to ask the Africans perhaps to give us a parting shot here, because the theme of this conference is BRICS in Africa, and right now we have a tool that is expected to really help the continent rise to the occasion. That's the AFCFTA, but from an SME perspective. So I'm giving Basim and Bijam 30 seconds each. From an SME perspective, how should that AFCFTA be fine-tuned to accelerate and capacitate a lot more SMEs, not only those on the continent, but also those in the BRICS grouping looking at the Africa opportunity? Your 30 seconds starts now, sir.
Pressure. Look, it comes back again to the same thing we always say. To solve a problem, you need to understand what the problem is.
Sure.
And we need to dig a lot deeper into how can SMEs become large entities. They can only become so if there are frameworks and understanding from government and regulations, because we're interconnected with government whether we like it or not. One way or the other, we're working in a definition of a policy defined by each country individually. And until we have some sort of a policy that enables these SMEs to have better access to capital, better regulation, updated regulation, and then most importantly, cooperation between government and business. I always hear about business councils and advice, but this is the key element. We need government and business to sit together, so we tell them what we like, and they can also advise us and hear from us what the challenges we're facing.
Got you. Bijou, do your best to give us the last word.
Just to add on to what he said, and it's just a small addition, it's actually reflecting from what our colleague from China just said. Supporting through venture capital structures and private equity funds, etc., that have helped build a lot of these startups into large corporations. That's it.
We'll make that the last word. To all of you, thank you so much. I think that you have provided valuable insights into the SME opportunity in the BRICS cluster and how to realize it further. I know that a lot more conversations are going to be taking place in the next 3 days, but I do believe that you have given us a wonderful starting point on which to continue those deliberations. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me thank my panelists for their valuable insights. And